I will right now. You're now being recorded, so smile big.
Okay.
Oh, geez. Thanks a lot.
Welcome, Scott and Paula and Judy.
Hi there.
Frank, you should be able to do it now.
Do what?
Create chaos.
Create
Yeah.
chaos.
Oh, how exciting. Yeah, that's better.
Oh,
I
it's
finally
good.
figured
Such a
out a
good
way to
turnout.
stand the phone up so I don't have to hold it.
Yeah,
I just
I'm
have to say, hello, Maureen.
Oh, what happened? Where everybody go? Oh, there you are.
Welcome, Jade and Patty.
Joyce is over there.
Okay, welcome, Judy and Joyce.
Hi, Jade.
Frank, does it seem to be working for you?
I'm hearing, I can bring up this. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think it'll show okay. So.
Okay.
We're fine, I think, Jim.
That's wonderful.
Frank, let us know when you want us to start muting.
Let's
Using what?
one more minute just to see. Jim, how many do we have signed in now? Do we know?
26.
26, yeah, okay.
What are you talking about? What are you talking about? Muting what?
Yeah, let's wait just one more minute and then see if more come in.
if you're on your iPhone, you have to tap the lower left corner and tap mute. Because I'm on an iPhone.
Over left corner. Okay. Let's see if I can figure out what you're talking about.
And on a computer, usually if you go to the right, upper right corner of your picture, you'll see the word mute or unmute.
Yeah, I see the word mute. Oh. And then
Just
right
click
now,
that
I
and then
do
you-
that?
Yeah.
Okay, why don't we begin? I have a brief introduction of Frank, and then he will pick it up and do whatever he does with it to make a good class for us. So, all of you, welcome to the first of 2 classes in grief, loss, and transformation. They are a joint effort of Mental Health Ministry and Stephen Ministry at St. Francis in the Foothills. May is Mental Health Awareness Month. So these classes are both timely and important. We know that all of us during the pandemic time have experienced loss and grief, whether we call it by that name or not. How then to transform it into how to transform what we have experienced. So I'm delighted to introduce our presenter for these 2 classes, who will help guide us through the process to transformation. Frank Williams is the founding pastor of St. Francis. He taught marriage and family counseling classes at the University of Arizona. He founded Divorce Recovery, and he was a member of family counseling staff. He has been involved with the issues of loss, grief, and dying for nearly 50 years. He is retired from Casa de la Luz Hospice and now is one of the founders of a new nonprofit, the Learning Community for Loss, Grief, and Transitions. Frank is a Tucson treasure, examining the needs of our community and initiating new ways to solve problems. And I am honored to call him friend. Frank.
Thank you, Diane. It is a wonderful privilege for me to be here with you today and next week for us to share in a topic that is so relevant both now and through our whole life, loss and grief and transformation. In being here, it is for me a privilege because I feel like I'm coming home. St. Francis really is home in so many ways, and so it's delightful again to be here and to share with you. As we begin, I'd like us to just take a moment and center ourselves to be present here. So for just a moment, if you wish to shut your eyes, just to breathe, take a moment of breath, deep breath in and out, and quiet ourselves that we can just be present in these moments together. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on us. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on us. Melt us, mold us, fill us, use us. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on us. I have learned over these 50 years of being involved with dying and death and grief and loss in a variety of different ways, that loss is a part of our life, that every day we're involved in one way or another in loss. We wake in the morning and we go to bed at night, and if we think through the day, oftentimes we will recognize that loss has been there, maybe not in major ways, but oftentimes in small and insignificant ways, but loss is there. It's a part of who we are. I love these words from Judith Viorst, who is a poet first, but who wrote several years ago a wonderful book on loss. In the course of our life, she says, we leave and are left and let go of much that we love. Losing is the price we pay for living. It's also much of our source of our gain and growth. And making our way from birth to death, we also have to make our way through the pain of giving up and giving up and giving up some portion of that which we cherish. Loss is a part of our life. As a result, all of us are bereaved. We've oftentimes used the word bereavement when it's only around dying or death. But really, bereavement means the state of having lost someone or something, and all of us are bereaved in one way or another. That's the experience of having lost something, someone. Now, some of those losses may be what I call mini, small losses, or midi, roll losses, or maxi, the major losses of our lives. Those mini losses are the small ones, almost the daily losses that we experience in our life. The car didn't start this morning. It was a battery, you know, it was one of those things where, well, it was a loss. It was a mini loss. I didn't spend a whole lot of time worrying about it, but it was there. Or a few months ago, I lost a journal that I had been writing in, and I had had some significant thoughts and poetry and writing for a book that I've tried to keep writing about, and I lost it. Well, I worried about it for a couple of weeks, I think, and never have found it, but it was a mini loss. And I expect if you look at your life, you will see those small, almost daily losses that come and that we experience. The mini role losses are the losses of the roles of our lives, the way we change. I retired a couple of years ago, and that was a role loss. Now, for some, it might have been a major life loss too. I watched students come to the University of Arizona many years ago, and they would come out of high school and they would come to the university, and their role of their life had changed from being a high school student to a college student. Or we changed jobs. The role losses are those medium kind of losses. For some people, they will be major losses. For others, they're many losses as well. It depends on how we look at them. And then there are those maxi losses, the losses that change the meaning of our lives. Death, divorce, chronic illness. And we might as well add marriage to that as well, or having a new child. And even though there are gains in those experiences, there's also loss. It changes the meaning of who we are, what we're all about. The thing that I recognize is that in those many and maxi losses, it differs for every one of us. We might have similar experiences of change. Many of us were retired, but my retirement's different than yours. Or my experience of death is different than yours. Or likewise, in terms of the midi losses, what I might experience in terms of a midi loss, a change of a role, moving from one job to another, doing something different that many of you have gone through, it's yours. And that's one of the things we need to remember about loss, is that it is unique to you. It is unique to every person. My loss is my loss. It is your loss. Now, what I want you to do, and you probably won't be able to read this on the screen, but I want you to take a few minutes. I want you to take a pencil and paper or something near you that you can. And I want you to think about this past year, about this year of COVID, about all the many losses that we've experienced. Or it doesn't have to be around COVID particularly, but I think about that myself and realize as I said, as some of you came in, I get to see my grandkids for the first time in a year tomorrow. And that was a loss. That's been a major kind of something missing out of my life. I was a grandpa, but the role loss was I wasn't able to be a grandpa, except on Zoom. And so I want you to think for a few minutes and just write down 5 losses. 5 losses that you have. 5 experiences of loss. What we've put up on the screen is losses that people have given, and we've shared the various losses of our life. I think there's 30 some of them all up there, and there are all kinds of losses. And I expect you can even think of more. All the losses of our lives. So take a few minutes. I'll give us a couple. I'm just going to bring us back together for a moment. And even though it may be difficult and we don't want chaos, which we might get if we ask, but I'd like it just to share a loss that you've experienced in this last year, that whether it be a mini loss or a midi loss or a maxi loss. So if you want to share, just kind of unmute yourself and we'll trust that. Vicki, you unmuted, it looked like, so.
Okay. Loss of a companion, best friend,
A companion and best friend.
my dog.
Okay. Yes.
I lost my father, and I lost the ability to have gatherings with friends, like we all pretty much did. And I lost a feeling of, being relatively safe around other people just because of COVID.
Yeah. Thank you. To speak up.
I also lost my dad. And I had already given up my home on the East Coast to move out here to help him. And very soon after I got here was when he passed. So I sort of lost my home and my purpose for coming here and my dad all in one fell swoop.
Yeah. Thank you. Bless it. Just go ahead and speak when you want to.
I think loss of easy mobility, moving where I wanted to go at any time.
Losing my husband and seeing all the empty stores and empty places and feeling so sorry for everyone that's been affected by that. And losing my sociable.
Thank you.
Loss of personal touch, hugging.
Lost my wife Pat due to cancer on 3/3/20.
Thanks, Daniel.
Lost the opportunity to be with family. We had a family reunion with my 4 siblings and all the cousins planned for last July, and we had to cancel it. We missed our daughter's wedding. She got married at Maricopa Courthouse with just her 2 kids there as her witnesses. And a lot of other just missed celebrations of life that we didn't get to be a part of this past year.
I think all of us, as we think about it and as we look back through this past year, all of those mini, midi, maxi losses are right there. They're a part of who we are. They reside with us. We think about them. If we look at it, and I'm going to go back to share screen here and we'll but if we kind of put them all together in kind of categories, the losses of lives are relationship losses, role losses, material possessions, systems by which I made the connections with people, with our grandkids, with others that we haven't had a chance to be with. Functional losses, which are the losses of the way our bodies move. As Diane said, the mobility, and the intrapsychic losses, the loss of the dreams, the loss of belief. We've gone through these this year. The relationship losses of just simply not being able to see someone or see a group of people that we've been with. The lack of being able to gather together in a community such as St. Francis. The inability to be with people. That's created it's been hard for us, I think, all of us. I am an introvert, and I thought, well, I can handle this and get through it, but I could for a few months, but after a while, there's a loss that is so deep with not being able to connect face to face with people. And the roles that we've played, we talked about those roles, but all of the various roles that we have, the material things of our lives, not being able to go on a vacation. We had planned, as you had, Doris, a vacation, family reunion kind of vacation, and we had to cancel it last year. And those kinds of vacations and those kinds of experiences and relationships, by the way, not only with people, but with pets. And I know this year with my grandson, we had the death of his pet, major pet this year. Or the systems change. The connections that we've had with people are different, and we've seen them on Zoom, but there's a loss there. I can't touch you. Or the functional losses of our bodies, doesn't work as well. Things don't move the same way that they moved. Or our intrapsychic losses, the loss of belief and hope and freedom and worthiness and all the things that we feel about ourselves. Lots of losses. And what happens is that with every loss, there is grief. Grief, by definition, is the many-faceted response to any loss. The mini losses, the midi losses, the maxi losses, those little ones that come every day of our lives, the major ones that happen only once in a while. That's grief that experienced. Someone said that grief is a tidal wave that overtakes you and smashes you into its darkness, where you tumble and crash against unidentifiable surfaces, only to be thrown out on an unknown beach, bruised and reshaped. We're not the same when we lose something. Even those small losses, when we grieve those losses, it's not the same. I was late for an appointment this morning because the car didn't run, and I had to get it battery charged, and I had to, I lost that. And while it was many, I felt the darkness of that moment just in that few minutes. And so all of the losses we experience are multifaceted, and they're different for each of us, just as the loss is unique to you. Grief is unique to you. Nobody else has what you have. Nobody else experiences the grief that you experience. And we experience grief in a number of ways. We experience grief physically, cognitively, emotionally, behaviorally, and spiritually. People who have been through it, and many of you have in a variety of different ways, large and small, can recognize that there's a physical experience to grief. Today in the New York Times, there was an article that's by a professor at the university who has been studying the biology of grief. Mary Frances is a good friend, and she has studied over the years the biology of grief. She recognizes that people's physical body changes, that we can measure how people grieve physically, that we can watch them and we can know what happens. And it's not unusual over the years, as I have worked with people who are going through grief, that they will tell me about the physical experience that they've had, how their body hasn't worked the same as it was, or they have headaches, or the problems with their stomach, or all sorts of different kinds of physical problems that may come. When you measure that in terms of blood pressure and in terms of blood tests, you find that the stress response that comes from grief, we can measure. Grief affects us physically. It also affects us cognitively. We don't think the same. We don't think as well when we go through grief. Years ago, when I was working with divorce recovery, we did a small sample test in which we asked people who were a part of the divorce recovery program whether in the last 6 months they had had a car accident of any kind. And then in measuring with the local traffic people, we found out that people going through divorce had a third higher rate of accidents than those who were not. We don't think the same. We're not clear. People will tell me that in grief, regardless of the kind of grief, little grief and medium grief and maxi grief, that we don't think as clearly as we did. We're not as focused. Emotionally, we oftentimes think about grief as being emotional, but it's much more, but it's all those emotions that are a part of it. The sadness, the loneliness, the fear, the anger, the rage, the bewilderment, all of the experiences that many people have had as they have gone through whatever the loss was. And behaviorally, I've known people who, as a result of going through grief, who have been very much of an outward person, connecting and relating to people who, during the time that they're going through the experience of grief, they don't want to talk to anybody. That their life is different. Or spiritually, there's a real connection to the spirit in grief. Sometimes it's a matter of doubting our life, doubting our spirit, doubting what we believe. Other times we jump into it all force, trying to make sense of life and asking the questions of why. So it becomes important to understand, as we look at grief, our own grief, to recognize that grief is not just emotional, but it's multifaceted. It's physical and cognitive and behavioral and spiritual and emotional. Now, I want to talk about a journey, the journey through grief. Doesn't mean we take it away, it's always there, but the journey through it. One that begins with the loss and the ending of the experience of whatever that loss brings. The fact that I couldn't see my grandkids for a year, you know, the loss of being able to touch them and hold them, to what we call the neutral zone, or William Bridges, who wrote a wonderful book called Transitions years ago, talked about the neutral zone. And recently, another work talks about the messy middle. I like that. As well as then to the new beginnings. Another way to look at it is through this map that I have used over many years. It really says a major life transition, a major transition through grief takes between 18 months and 4 years. Mini losses take probably a few hours to a few days, maybe a couple weeks, and midi losses, they take a few months to 6 months or such. And again, we're guessing about those. We have no real clarity about it. I've had a lot of arguments with people doing research around how long does it take to get through a death? How long does it take to get through a divorce? How long does it take to get comfortable with retirement? How long does it take to get through a new job and taking on a new task? So we have some ideas about it. We know that the endings after a loss mean that we have to grieve those losses. We have to accept the fact that we've gone through a loss and that it tears us apart, that it sometimes wipes us out. And so we have to grieve those losses. And then we enter into, if we can move on through this journey into what Bridges has talked about being the neutral zone or the messy middle, which in some ways may be the best part of going through this journey, where we have to begin to figure out who I am and what's my life all about now. I've lost something. I've lost something of me, out of me. There's a hole in me, as people will say. And they have to figure out how are they going to get through it. And so in that neutral zone, and sometimes that takes as long as the endings, to figure out who am I now and what's my life all about now. And then perhaps, and hopefully true, there's a sense of healing and transformation that comes in new beginnings. So as we begin to think about this journey, and we move through this journey, I've learned some things about it. William Bridges says that the way of life is a journey. It's a journey that we take and we go on a winding path. There seems to be no logic sometimes to it, but being on it, being on the journey makes all the difference. As I go through the experience of it, I realize that some people go through this journey rather rapidly. They do. They can go through from one loss and major losses in their lives or roll losses, and they go on. Others people get stuck in the loss and the endings. They get stuck. They can't move. They don't know where to go. They don't know how to do it. We're going to talk about how we get through it in a moment. Other people will jump from one part of it to another because they don't want to deal with the grief. They don't like the grief. It's too painful. And so instead of staying in the endings and dealing with the grief, they jump to something new. And so we found in divorce recovery and the issues around divorce and that loss, that people jumped from the endings into new beginnings, oftentimes without having gone through the neutral zone, let alone finish their grief. And during COVID and during this time, we've been stuck oftentimes in the endings, in the grief, one loss after another, one experience after another. And we're getting to the place now when we're beginning to try to figure out what will happen now. And so some of us are moving, having been vaccinated twice and feeling some comfort level, that we begin to think, who am I now? I'm not the same person that I was at the beginning of this journey a year ago. And how am I going to get through it? So I've learned that this journey is a journey that all of us take, and that being on it makes a difference. I've also learned that we either grieve and make something out of it, or the grief can destroy us. The loss has shattered who we are, shattered the fabric of our world, shattered our own being, and we're now being called, and we do when we've gone through a loss, any loss, the loss of a husband, the loss of a wife, any loss, that now we are called to either have something born out of it, or it destroys us. But I've also learned that most people are resilient. That means that they have the ability to bounce back, to recover. They're not stuck in it. And so what we discover in some of the very basic research around grief and loss has been that most people actually get through it without much difficulty, regardless of what the loss is. They bounce back. So the death of a spouse may be, for one person, something that tears them apart, and for another, it isn't. Working with Casa de la Luz Hospice for 11 years and working in bereavement for these years, I discovered that one of the things that we knew is that most people did not go through any kind of support groups or seek out any kind of bereavement counseling. Most people just went through it. Somebody died, and it didn't mean that they didn't deal with it one way or the other. They did, but they didn't have to seek out, or they did not seek out other people. But I've also learned that the journey out of grief isn't some lockstep process of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We talk a lot about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her work. And I loved Elizabeth, and I knew her and loved the work that she did in terms of dying and grief, even death. But what we've learned is that her model doesn't bear fruit in terms of people going through grief. You can't just simply cross off the process. There's not 5 stages, there's 105 stages, as someone has said. That it doesn't happen just one right after another. And even if we go back and forth, it's not quite that clear. I've also learned that there is no such thing as closure in grief. Regardless of even the little griefs, they stick with us. They're there. The loss of the journal of several months ago that I had, and it stays with me every now and then. I'll wonder, well, I wonder what happened to that. I wonder where it went. And so there's a myth of closure. And the best that we can oftentimes do is to reconcile in our grief. Just simply reconcile. That means that I adjust, I make the changes necessary so that I can move on. In this list of the signs of reconciliation, what that means for me is that I talk about it being a kind of a quick and dirty way of looking at my life as I go through grief. You know, am I recognizing the reality and the finality of the loss? Am I now able to enjoy experiences in my life again? Am I trying to put my life and my tasks of my life back together again? Those are kind of the signs of reconciliation, of being able to reconcile within me the losses that I've experienced. And I've also learned that grief isn't something that you can complete. It's not closure. Grief is something we endure. It's not a task that I get through and finish and then move on, but rather grief becomes an element of yourself. It's an alteration of your being. It's a new way of seeing. It's a new definition of who we are, what we're all about. And for me, that's transformation. That in this journey, which hopefully is a journey of healing, there is a way by which we can move through this to not just simply get stuck in the ending or in the messy middle, but rather move on to transformation. Or as one person said, not only transformation, but transcendence, to rise above. We're going to talk more about this journey and how do we get through it? What do we do? I believe that it is a healing journey and that there is help that we can get. And that the help is really on the way of the journey. Over the years, as I've found myself, I'm going to go back on this journey, as I found myself working with people on the journey, that the ending is much like a wilderness. It's like the wilderness that's there in the picture. It's sometimes very difficult to find your way out of it even. I've used the analogy of saying it's like being up on Mount Lemmon and looking down and realizing there's Tucson down below us. How do I get there? How do I get through all of the pain? How do I get through the physical pain? How do I get through the emotional pain? How do I begin to figure out my life again? We are bereaved. We have lost things. So how are we going to get through it? What are we going to do? So let me share some thoughts about getting through the journey, about healing on this journey. The first is to tell our stories. When we remember, we put ourselves back together. That's what it is. We reconfigure ourselves. We remember our being. So that what was is no longer, but it's in our mind. It is a remembrance. Can you remember back a year ago? Linda and I were at a workshop and we came out of the workshop and discovered, and we had not had any television or radio, in fact, no way. And we came out of the workshop of a week and discovered we were in the middle of a pandemic. Or can you remember back when that person who was in your life was? Sure, we do. We remember. And as we tell the stories, we begin to heal. Now, the points that I'm going to make are not in any kind of order. They're kind of, we have to just put them all together. But I know that by remembering and telling the story, I do begin to heal. I find myself remembering a woman whose husband died suddenly. And over the years, as she would share with me, she said at one point, you told me that I would be telling the story, but I didn't realize that I would be telling it again and again and again, even to the postman. And so telling that story to someone, sometimes it's to a person or to a family member or to a group. Sometimes you don't tell it to anybody, you write it down. I keep saying to people, one of the best ways of remembering and telling our stories is to write it out, is to journal. Or to write a poem. Or I had somebody that wrote the beginning of a screenplay about dying. Or I remember someone telling me about how they went through their divorce, and we used to do a divorce recovery grief group at the university every week. It was a crisis group. People would come, drop in, share their divorce. And sometimes they would have to tell that story again and again and again and again. So I got to the place where I would say, tell me their story. And next week, when you come back, tell me the story again, but tell it to me in half the time. And tell me the story in half the time again the next time. But we need to tell the stories. I remember that storytelling is so critical. It's part of what we know in our spiritual life. Stories are what connect us. All we have to do is to open the Bible almost any place, and you're going to get a story. And those stories tell us things. So as we begin to talk about how do we get through this journey? How do we connect again on this journey? We begin by telling our stories. The second is to find and use support, to find that healing presence in our lives. Healing presence is the condition of being consciously and compassionately in the present moment with another or with others. In order to tell a story, really to tell a story, you got to have somebody tell it to. And as I said, that may be a family member, that may be a friend, just somebody who listens to us, who affirms me. I believe so strongly that there is no gift that is greater for any of us than to be able to listen to another human being, to really listen to another human being, to just let somebody share their story. When I listen with my whole being, when I'm present with somebody, I am a healing present. When Martha went through the death of her son, it devastated her, turned her upside down. She never experienced anything like it before. The pain was so great. And she remembered telling me the story about walking on by Lake George in New York. And she said, I walked there by myself. And then I walked there with my friend. And my friend said to me, tell me the story about Michael. And so she did again and again. So whether it's been a mini loss, whatever that mini loss is, the loss of time this year, the loss of not having people over, the loss of not having that touch that we so desperately need. When we don't have those and we experience that loss and we grieve, the way through the journey, part of the way through the journey is to tell a story. And I need somebody to tell the story to. Isn't that it? I know that there is that kind of support out there. We, over the years in Tucson, I found that we really in this community have a number of good, wonderful grief counselors who are able to really walk with people through their stories. Or grief groups that are available. I know that some people don't need it. They just move on in their life. They do. They are resilient and they bounce back and they walk through that journey without really asking or needing. But what I've discovered is that most of them love to tell the story if you will ask. And so it's asking and being present that becomes so important and so critical. The third is what I call creative action. I have a hard time just trying to figure out what to call it and describe it. But in every part of the journey, there comes a point in which I have to make specific some kind of action that is creative. The statue that is there is really kind of a sculpture that describes the wife of a man whose wife died, and he in some ways tried to put it together into a sculpture. He says, every day I look out upon my garden and that sculpture is there and it reminds me every day of my wife. Zoom has become a creative action for many of us who have grandkids. It was a way in which we connected every week with our grandchildren in Phoenix. Sometimes they didn't want to specifically and especially be there, and we were on for a little while and then off, but it was a creative action. Sometimes that creative action is a matter of writing and journaling. Those of you who may know my wife, Linda, she has taught and really encouraged people to journal for years. In fact, the workshop that we went to before we entered into the pandemic and came back from Phoenix was a journaling workshop, and it was a matter of writing out things. And so to tell the story and to write about the loss, even the little losses. When we think about all those losses that you put down, hopefully you did, those 5 losses, or the losses that were sent to you in the handout, all of those losses that we had, and we can add to them. All those losses mean that we're going to grieve, even the little ones. And to get through the journey, then we need to mark those. We do it in concrete ways around major losses in our country. When you think about it, all the memorials that we have are concrete, creative ways in which we remember. And so that the January 8th memorial downtown is a creative way of remembering. But we do it all the time in our own way. Sometimes it's a matter of we have a graveyard that's in our yard of pets. It's been covered over a few times, and there's been numbers of pets that have now been dug up on the top of the hill, and they are there. It's a creative way of remembering the death of a pet. Or sometimes it's we've given things away. As you get older, that's one of those losses that we know that we need to take, that as there are things we have to give away. Otherwise, that stuff is going to be there that our kids are going to have to deal with. I'm sure that many of you know that, you know, all that stuff that we've got. So as we give things away, sometimes that's really hard. And so this past 3 years, we've been giving away all of our nativity sets to our kids. We collected them for 30 years. And now we give them away, and that's a loss. And so what we have done in order to do something about that is to make sure that we take a picture of everything and we keep the picture. Whatever those may be, however we may do the creative aspect of our lives, things by being creative become important. And we mark our remembrance. We mark our remembrance. Sometimes it's creating a scrapbook so we can remember certain things, certain moments that no longer will be, certain people that no longer will be. And so during this past year, I can say that I have written, I play at writing poetry, and so it becomes just fun to do. And so I have my COVID poems. but there are ways of creatively marking the moments, from going to the grocery store as a senior with a mask, to not seeing our grandkids, to doing other things that are to remember in those moments. Creative action, not just simply letting it pass by. And so the woman who came to counseling out of a divorce brought her a box one evening. I remember it so clearly that she brought this box and put it down on the desk. And I said, "What is that for?" And she said, "I want to remember, and I want to mark this moment as a time of ending the marriage." "Okay, what are you going to do?" I asked. And she opened the box, and there were the china that she and her husband got for their wedding. And through the appointment, she proceeded to break every piece of china. She marked that moment. And years later, she would say, "Do you remember?" So I encourage you to think about that. Think about how we remember. And by creative action, doing something that marks the moment. And then finally, what we might call transformation and transcendence. It's that new beginnings. I believe at the core of it is finding meaning in our lives. Finding meaning. The philosopher Viktor Frankl, who some of you may have read in the past, Viktor Frankl spent time in Auschwitz, in prison camp. And out of it came a wonderful book on Man's Search for Meaning. And in it, he says that anyone who goes through this kind of loss, and that's what it is, that he who has a yes, he who has meaning, he who has a yes can withstand the loss. Now, what does that mean? It means that in our life, if we are to get through this journey of pain and loss, regardless of whether the loss is small or major, that in order to do it, we have to find some meaning in it. That to experience that sense of meaning again is critical. And again, to quote, grief is not something you complete. It's something you endure. It's not a task to finish and then move on, but an element of yourself, an alteration of your being, a new way of seeing, a new definition of self. And how we do that becomes critical as we move through this journey. I know that some people get stuck. It is interesting to know, as I've talked about resilience and the fact that most people are resilient. And the research really does indicate that 50% of those people going through any loss will make it through without really hardly any help. That another 40% will need to find someone by which they can share, or they'll go through a group, or they'll go to counseling and they'll find that. And there is another 10% that really does get stuck. It's the chronic grievers. But in finding meaning in our life and being able to find it, then we can do what some of the writers are now saying, we can flourish. We can transcend, which means to rise above. Four things in that. One is spirituality. We have discovered that people who have a faith of some kind, they believe in something outside of themselves, whatever that may be, that they are a part of a spiritual journey. They experience that spirituality in them, in their heart and their lives. Move through the journey with some sense of healing that oftentimes is not present otherwise. The second is that they are willing to reach out beyond themselves. And I know that's hard. I know that when you're going through grief, many times you don't want to talk to anybody. You don't want to see anybody. Sometimes it's forcing ourselves to reach out in order that we can touch somebody and somebody can touch us, not so much physically, but being able to listen to our story. The third is attitude. That I come with an attitude that says, I may not know, I don't know everything, I don't know how to get through this, but I'm open to the possibilities that may come. And finally, it's reinvestment. I'm willing to reinvest myself in life. You know, I know that there are those who don't have an opportunity to do it and are frightened and don't know how. I go back to the fact that it is in telling our stories to somebody. It isn't talking about how difficult it is. It's the willingness to have somebody listen deeply. And so I try to help and say that how do we reinvest? How do we move on? How do I find that meaning? And so Joanna, whose husband died several years ago, has got a dog, and she spent the last 3 years training that dog and is a pretty good dog trainer now. Or Philip, who never could cook anything, has learned how to cook. And he's really a very good cook. Or someone who could not change spark plugs in a car, in an old car, learned how to change spark plugs and was able to do it. Have you ever taken an awe walk, A-W-E walk? Sure you have. You walk in the morning and you look and you see the Catalinas, or you see, and it's awe. It's that sense of awe that we have. Or people who are, one of the exercises that we gave some people was just simply to take a photograph every day of something that they appreciated, for which they were grateful. And so in between sessions of a group, they took pictures every day. It became part of a fun of a group that they could show the pictures, and it connected them to the world in which they were living, and their life was changed as a result of the grief that they were going through. And here was something new. People say to me, well, I can't do that. I do believe what Devorah Coriel says, that we can either we decide and we make a decision, and it's a decision that we make to say yes to life. And we grow, or we don't say yes. And as a result, we despair. We can move through grief. It is a journey. What's the journey again? The journey through loss. At the beginning, we talked about loss and all the losses of our lives, from the little losses that we've experienced this year as a result of COVID to the major losses that we've also experienced, the death of someone, or the death of a pet, or the death of a relationship. We look back over the year and we've had 9 major deaths of people that we know. And I realize when you grow older, those deaths happen and people die. And every one of those deaths hits us in our hearts. And every one we grieve in one way or another. Sometimes it's major, sometimes it's not as much of a grief. But we grieve in multifaceted ways. Physically, behaviorally, emotionally, cognitively, spiritually. We grieve. All of us do. I just know, and I believe so strongly, that on this journey from the beginning as a result of a loss, whatever the loss is, through that crazy up and down roller coaster wilderness of the endings, and with all of the pain, all the hurt of the grief, through that neutral zone, that messy middle where we have to take stock with who I am now. What do I want to do? Do I want to move on in my life? And when I make that decision and we begin to do it, and we reach out and we take somebody else's hand, and somebody else is willing to listen to us, and we listen to one another and we hear, then we move on to new beginnings, and it is transforming in our lives. It is. It's transcendent. We rise up. This morning I was reading the New York Times online, oftentimes do, and I came across a story that I only share now because you might want to go back and look at the New York Times, or you might ask about the Institute for Flourishing at Harvard. Now, to flourish is physical, mental, emotional, and I'd say spiritual fitness. We feel good. We flourish in our lives. And the opposite of which is to languish, to stagnate. And I think most of us want to flourish. We do. And so as we go through this journey and we take this journey of loss and grief, find ourselves at a door. It's open. We stand off of one side of it and we look out. Oh, there's a cactus out there. I'm not sure I can make it through. I'm not sure that I can walk through that door into the sunlight. But I will tell you that if you do, your life will be transformed. You will grow. You will be changed. That's the promise too, that if I stand at the door and knock, the door will be opened. It will. I begin and end in the same way. And I look forward to next week and your questions. Write them down this week. Send them to Nancy, send them to me. Just get my email is frankwjr@aol. And send me the questions, or send them to Nancy, or send them to Diane. Send the questions. And I'll have with me Chris Masalski, who is a member at St. Francis and who, as a result of her work in the field of suicide, as a result of the death of her son many years ago, brings a wealth of knowledge. And Eileen Adler, who's been with Divorce Recovery now for 15 years and has worked with me. And we work together on the Learning Community for Loss, Grief, and Transition, relatively new organization in Tucson that we've created to help people who want to help others on grief and loss and transitions. And so I invite you to write those questions and send them to us. And even if you don't, hopefully you'll come and we, the three of us will share, and we'll invite you to share and to ask the questions and to tell your stories. So I invite you just for a moment into the silence, to breathe. To quiet yourself. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on us. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on us. Meld us, mold us, fill us, use us. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on us. Amen. Amen. I look forward to seeing you and being with you next week. Thank you.
Well,
Thank you, Frank.
Frank?
Okay, Maureen, ask me. I'm not sure I'll be able to write it down, but if you ask me the question, we'll try and answer it next week.
All right, well, I'll write it down. I'll write it down.
Okay, that'll be good. Yeah, that'll be good. I appreciate that. Thank you.